Okay, so recording has started.
Okay, thank you everybody. Thank you for that introduction. Good morning, if that's what your time zone is, where you are in the world. It's morning here in the UK. So I'm Jane Pilcher. I'm going to be talking to you really about names and identities, with a particular focus on names and identities in education and why it matters to respect people's name-based identities, including saying people's names right, pronouncing people's names right. So that's the focus of today's talk. So, first problem is I can't advance my slides. There we go. So this is the agenda for today. We're going to do a bit of thinking about our own names to kind of warm our brains up and get us thinking about what our names mean to us. I'm going to talk then about names and identity more broadly and hopefully expand your understanding of why and how names matter for people's identities. I'm then going to talk a little bit in more detail about names, particularly in educational contexts, to the extent that we have any knowledge and understanding of names in educational contexts and how they operate. Then I'm going to pass over to Hannah to talk about our Say My Name research, where we're going to share some particularly participant voices about their experiences of names in education. Then we're going to move on to looking at how you can do things to help yourself and other people better respect names in educational contexts. Then I'm going to ask for some feedback, share some resources, and fingers crossed right at the end there should be time for some questions and answers. So this next little bit then involves you popping off to Mentimeter or menti.com, and you'll see when you get there, if you use your mobile phone to do this, it might be easier. When you get there, there'll be a code that I'll show you in a minute that you enter in order to participate in this. So it is anonymous. Nothing will come up about your name. Interestingly, you will be anonymous. And the things I want you to contribute here is what does your name mean to you, and does your name have a meaning? So I'm just going to toggle to Mentimeter now. And you should be seeing the code there at the top of the screen, 7470576. And there'll be a short delay while people are firstly navigating to menti.com, then putting the code in, and then adding some content here. So we've already had one contribution. So obviously, names do connect us to our families, to our kin, principally through our surnames, but also sometimes we might get named after our grandmother or a favourite aunt or something. That's an interesting one. My name means listener. I wonder what other contributions we'll have in a moment. Don't know the meaning of my name, but it's core to my identity. It's me, absolutely. So my name, Jane Pilcher. Jane's quite a common name in some ways. Pilcher's a bit of an unusual surname. And you might think there's only one Jane Pilcher in the world, but there are plenty of Jane Pilchers in the world, even though it's core to my identity. It's core to who I think I am. You get called it multiple times in different contexts. So it very much is tied into who your identity is. So we've got loads more coming through now. So we've got some sort of literal meanings of names. One there, shiny, bright, or tower in Hebrew. So someone there must be called Jane, because I think Jane is the female equivalent of John. Like myself. My name means fair and honest. My first name means independent being. Some lovely stuff coming through. Don't know what my name means, but I've grown into it. You can look up the meaning of your name, because most names do actually have a kind of original meaning somewhere down the line. So Jane, my own name, derives from, well, it's the feminine form of John, which itself derives from a Hebrew word which means grace of God. So somewhere along the line your name will probably have a meaning. So we've got some lovely stuff coming through. We won't be able to probably scroll through all of them because there's so many participants in this workshop today. But we've got some lovely stuff. So someone changed their name because they found their original family name embarrassing. My name means shining light. So some lovely stuff there about how names can be very meaningful to our sense of identity and how we think of ourselves as individual beings. I'm just going to return to the slideshow now. Okay, so some great stuff there in terms of what our names mean to us and whether there is a kind of original literal meaning to our names. So that's warmed us up a little bit in terms of thinking about names and identities. So we've already seen from some of those contributions, names are really important for how we think of ourselves as individuals, for our individual identity. It's like a kind of legal sense of who we are, as well as a very personal, meaningful sense of who we are. Names are also very important for our familial and kinship connections. But as we've also seen from some of those contributions there on screen, names are also part of our kind of social and cultural identities, whether we're thinking about our gender identities or our kind of ethnic identities. So there's a whole host of ways in which names are significant for these different aspects of who we are, who we think we belong to, whether that's a family connection or a kind of ethnic group connection, the kind of heritage of ourselves and our ancestors. All these things are connected to the names that we have. So names are important for example, distinguishing gender. Very often names are quite specific. They're used for boys or girls. That's not true of all cultures, but it's true of many cultures. So names can help kind of identify us as gendered beings. I've already talked about ethnicity. So forenames, first names, given names can signify our ethnicity and can be deliberately chosen to celebrate our ethnic heritage by our parents. There's also some evidence that names are significant too in terms of social class. So some names are more prevalent amongst some higher social classes and less prevalent amongst lower social classes and vice versa. Names also can indicate how old we are, in broadly speaking. So if I use my own name as an example, Jane, when I was named by my parents when I was born in 1965, Jane was a top 10 girls' name. It was a very popular girl's name in 1965. Nowadays, Jane isn't even in the... It's a very popular girl's name in 1965. Nowadays, I'm getting a bit of feedback. It's a very popular girl's name in 1965. Nowadays, a bit of feedback. Any thoughts about why that's happening?
If everybody makes sure they're muted. So Joanna, I think the sound's coming through your computer. Okay, I think that should be okay now again. Oh no.
Okay, I'm going to try again.
Yeah.
So I was saying that Jane must.
Hello, can I?
So I was saying that Jane.
I think Joanna. There we go. Joanna is on twice.
Jane marks me out as being a middle-aged woman because, you know, when I was born, it was a very popular name. And nowadays it's not even in the top 150 girls' names. So if you see somebody called Jane, they're most likely to be a middle-aged woman like myself. The other thing to think about when we're talking about names and identities is how naming conventions vary by culture. I've already said that in many cultures, gender is indicated by the type of name that you have, your first name, your given name. But even my term first name is a kind of ethnocentric assumption because not everyone's first name is their given name. In some cultures, there are different name ordering conventions that don't necessarily match the prevalent conventions that there are in the UK about having a first name and having a surname or a family name in that order. It's not true of all naming conventions around the world, and we need to be conscious of that kind of variation when we're thinking about names and identities. My last 2 points here relate to positive and negative name-based experiences in terms of our identities. So I already said about how your parents might choose your name, your first name, your given name, to kind of affirm and positively celebrate your cultural heritage. So there's some examples on the screens there about Islamic names, for example, or African American baby names. So some parents might want to really choose a name like that to really kind of tie their baby and their other children to that kind of cultural heritage. That's a very positive affirmation about one's name and one's identity. But unfortunately, names can also lead to more negative experiences because there are such things as name-based discrimination, particularly has name-based job discrimination is something that's been researched. So in the UK, one of the best known studies here is a Department for Work and Pensions study, which sent out multiple CVs, all with the same skills and experience listed and qualifications listed in those CVs. The only difference was the name that was at the top of those CVs. And that study found that people whose names were perceived to be non-white, non-British names didn't get as many callbacks. They didn't progress through the job kind of application process as far as people who had names which were perceived to be white names. So names can really matter in terms of those kind of equality, diversity and inclusivity issues. And that's something I'm going to be talking about more as we go through. I've got the echo back again. Okay, so next, a little bit of light-hearted fun looking at name issues and names and identity issues. So some of you may have had this experience already. You go into a coffee shop, you put your coffee order into the barista and they say, well, what name shall I write on the coffee cup? So this is what this short video is about. It's about 3 minutes long. Look at the subtitles when you're going through this, because they are kind of set to read, and it becomes even more kind of informative about names and identities. So I'm just going to play that now.
What can I get you?
Can I just get 3 cappuccinos, please?
Oh, you're Irish. Oh, I love them. Can I take a name?
Aoife, can you handle this? Siobhan, can you handle this?
Tonal, can you handle this?
We don't think you can handle this. There's a G in Siobhan. Use a G, you be wrong.
There's an M with me, and my vens, GHB.
Donica, that's the name. Better than you, you're not insane. Call yourself with a T. Can you handle me? You're a nice barista, but you're gonna have to step it up. My cousin's name is Sweet, but even I find out one try to read my lips off and see if it's lovely. What is it? You ready for this thing? You ready for this thing? You ready for this thing?
So,
Just put Joe.
what can I get you?
Can I just get 3?
So a
What can I get
light-hearted,
you?
well, I still want to play it. So a light-hearted treatment of quite a serious kind of name, really. It's about someone not knowing how to spell, how to pronounce someone's name, and someone having to adjust their name-based identity in order to accommodate that lack of knowledge and that lack of understanding. And that's something I'm going to be returning to in a minute when I talk about that kind of experience in educational contexts. So here on the screen, we can see a few things there, which I'm using as an introduction to how names might be seen to matter in educational contexts, and some things that you might already be familiar with as people working in the educational space. So one way that names matter already in education is anonymous marking. So we use anonymous marking when we're kind of grading our students' work, often in education, to try and avoid conscious or unconscious bias. So we might know the student, we might kind of favour them, we might give them higher marks because we know them, or we might know them, we might not like them, we might mark them down. We might discriminate them against them on the basis of their name, according to whether we perceive that person to be a man or a woman, or to be of a particular ethnicity. So anonymous marking is meant to kind of avoid that name-based discrimination, exactly why it's anonymous in the first place. The other thing that people might have experience of already is where international students, when they study at an English-speaking university, they might voluntarily rename themselves to an English name. So they might call themselves Rose or John or something rather than their ethnic name. So this is something perhaps we may have experienced, particularly with Chinese students, for example, or Taiwanese students studying in English-speaking universities. So the argument is they voluntarily rename themselves, and they do so in order to avoid sort of, it's like a pragmatic decision that they choose to make to avoid problems of pronunciation, writing down their names, and those kinds of issues. And often, if you don't know how to pronounce the students' names and you don't know how to write it down, then educators might find it actually hard to remember the name in the first place. So the argument has been that this is a pragmatic, voluntary decision by international students in order to avoid those kinds of problems, of worries, concerns about pronunciation and writing their names down. The other kind of example of naming in educational context that I want to talk about is something that we can think of more as involuntary naming experiences. And this is something that researchers in the US particularly have had a look at in terms of what they've called the involuntary renaming of minority ethnic students by their educators. So these have been portrayed as racial and cultural microaggressions. So this is when educators persistently mispronounce a student's name, don't get around ever to learning how to say it properly, or they decide that the student's name is too difficult to pronounce, so they're going to call them something else entirely different that is easier for the educator to pronounce. This has also been described as sort of taking out, bleaching the ethno-racial or socio-cultural information that is encoded in a student's name. So it's very much part of the kind of equality, opportunity, diversity, inclusivity agenda. So we also have some evidence from these studies about how students feel when their names are said wrongly by educators in classroom contexts. So from these studies, we know that students felt othered, they felt embarrassed, they felt like they didn't belong in the classroom space because their names were being said wrongly by the educators. On the other hand, more positively, when students' names were said correctly by the educators, students felt like they belonged, they felt empowered, and they felt proud of their ethnic heritage to the extent that that was signalled through their name. Does this issue bother everybody? We have a study of international students which suggests that it's about half and half. So about half say it's of something of low importance when their name gets mispronounced by educators. Just over half said it's of some importance or of high importance to them when their name gets mispronounced. So I think taking all this evidence together, clearly there is an equality, diversity and inclusivity issue around students' experiences of the pronunciation of their names in classrooms. It's not important for everybody, but it is important for a significant proportion of the students, according to the evidence that we do have. We don't have any evidence about students in higher education in the UK, though, and this is where my work and Hannah's work comes in. So I'm just going to pass over to Hannah now, who's going to start sharing with you in a very kind of, not too detailed level, our study and our findings.
Hi, good morning, everyone. So yeah, as Jane says, I'm going to talk through some of the findings from the Say My Name research project. The project was funded by the British Academy and was a small scale study focusing on the pronunciation of student names in universities in England. We looked at the experiences of both teaching and professional services staff within those universities and students, including international students. And we included 10 staff members and 20 students. So to talk about some of the key findings, firstly, we found that lecturers often avoided saying student names in a bid to avoid the issue of mispronunciation. This often included using strategies such as saying mate or buddy or tapping on the shoulder or pointing, lots of different strategies to actually avoid saying the name with a fear of getting it wrong. But what we found when talking to the students was this didn't go unnoticed. The students knew that this was happening and often sort of found it quite an awkward experience themselves when they felt someone was trying not to say their name. So lecturers did want to do better at saying students' names. They often had strategies of their own already in place. They welcomed improvements in their own universities and more generally, and often their motivation for taking part in the study was because this was an issue they sort of felt that they wanted to improve themselves in their working life. So the power and hierarchy in that relationship between the staff and the students was often a determining factor whether students felt willing or able to correct mispronunciation of their name. Ultimately, it was unlikely that students were going to be willing to correct, particularly in a public setting, to correct a member of teaching staff who was getting their name wrong on one or more than one occasions. Students felt excluded, disrespected, lacking in confidence when their name was mispronounced or avoided. And this did result in sort of a lack of participation or willingness to answer questions or put themselves forward for things in a classroom setting for some students. And on a positive level, students felt respected and seen when their names were said correctly. So if we can move on to the next slide, Jane. So this is just some of the voices of the students, and this is a range of student respondents, which highlights some of the issues students faced in relation to mispronunciation of their names. So I'm just going to give you a minute to have a read through some of those quotes there. So just to draw your attention to a couple of the quotes on here, this large bubble in the top right corner reads, I think a lot of teachers have the fear of pronouncing your name incorrectly, so they don't call you at all. It's maybe just a bit demoralizing. It affects your class contribution. It affects how teachers perceive you. And this quote's important because it highlights what I said previously about how a feeling of belonging and inclusion in the classroom can ultimately impact on engagement and learning outcomes for students who are in that environment, who might be put off being in that environment or participating because of mispronunciation. And on a positive level, the smaller dark blue rectangle in the middle says, so the lecturer kept saying my name again and again until he got it right. That was a really good situation of someone trying to get my name right. And it just shows that our findings weren't all negative. There were really good examples of good practice from both the staff and the students, of them really trying to get names right, really trying to respect this and really make students feel like they were at least trying, even if they didn't get it right first time. And that was really appreciated by the students. So next, we're going to look at the voices of some of the staff members. And these quotes here really highlight how staff overwhelmingly considered the pronunciation of names to be an EDI issue, and highlight some of the strategies used by staff. So I'll just give you a minute to have a look at them.
hear me, by the way.
So this box in the bottom right corner, the quote reads, "To correct how someone says your name takes confidence." I don't think it's fair to expect students, particularly international students, to have that level of confidence. And this shows that staff were aware that that hierarchy in the relationship between themselves and students was a factor that was stopping students from correcting their mispronunciation. And I think this is really important because it sort of highlights that the improvements needs to come from staff in a lot of occasions, because we can't expect students to have that confidence or that willingness to publicly say, oh, you're getting my name wrong, to someone that they really do want to show a lot of respect to. So this sort of highlights how it is staff that sort of need to be part of that improvement. And this quote in the top right says, "You can't train everybody to be able to pronounce everyone's names, but training can raise awareness of issues that students might encounter when their name is mispronounced, and so staff could put strategies in place." And this really highlights how not everyone's going to be able to get everyone's name right all the time. For most people, that's just not a feasible expectation. You know, Jane and I do research into names and pronunciation, and we still have conversations of, how do you think we say this person's name? You know, the pressure to get it right. Not everyone can get people's names right. But what we can do is help both staff and students know how to try to get it right and what to do when they think, oh, this is a name that I find challenging and I'm not going to be able to get this right. How to best approach that encounter between staff and students in universities. So that leads quite nicely onto what Jane's going to talk about next, about some of these strategies that we might be able to use.
Thank you, Hannah. So firstly, what can you do to help others pronounce your name correctly? The important thing to remember here is that you shouldn't assume that for everyone your name is easy to pronounce. So my own name, Jane Pilcher, you might assume that's pretty easy to pronounce, but if you're Spanish, trying to say Jane is a difficult sort of sound to get right, to replicate the English way of saying Jane. So don't assume that your own name is going to be easy for everybody else to say correctly. So one way is to kind of do what we did at the start of this session, explain to people what your names mean to you and in your culture and how it ties into your identity, because not everyone understands how important names are for people's identities in terms of, you know, the wider sense of who they are rather than just naming them as an individual person. If people do say your name incorrectly, feel free, it's your name, to correct your colleagues or your clients or your students or whoever it is who's doing that mispronouncing. Maybe do that in a one-to-one meeting rather than a group setting, because it can be embarrassing and awkward if you do things like that in a group setting. And in a one-to-one meeting, people really aren't going to mind. They're going to appreciate being instructed by you how to respect you as an individual person. Another thing that I think is important to do, it's not necessarily going to help you in a classroom situation, but it might help people get more familiar with how to say your name correctly, is to add what's called an audio name badge to your email signature. So this is something that's quick and free and easy to do. I'm hoping this is going to work. So if I click on this now, it should take me to my own audio created name badge, which you can do at Name Coach. And this is something I've got now embedded in my email signature. It's just a little audio recording of me saying my name, Jane Pilcher. Doesn't sound like me, it sounds very deep voice there. Jane Pilcher. So you can do that for free, very easily, and add that to your own email signature. And then people will get more familiar with how to say your name. If they're going to meet you, then they can play that in advance of meeting you and feel more confident about how to say your name. I think it's adding emails, audio name badges to email signatures is good because it normalizes declaration of our preferred pronunciation of our names in the same way that we're beginning to normalize declarations of our preferred pronouns. Many people now have in their email signatures or in their kind of staff profile pages, if you're an educator, your preferred pronouns. And that's great. It's normalizing declaration of pronoun use and preferred pronouns. And I'd like to see that happening too with pronunciation of our names. So on the screen there in the speech bubbles, you can see some kind of little sort of phrases that you might think about using in these contexts, and little strategies. So one would be to say, by the way, you're pronouncing my name incorrectly. It's pronounced so-and-so. Or I'd love to teach you what my name means and how to say it correctly. And then some strategies on the far left screen there. Like most of the time when I'm meeting someone new and I introduce my names, I say my name out loud. So every time somebody goes wrong with my name, I tend to correct them. I tend to explain to them what it is and how different it is from how they've just said it. So that's what you can do to help others pronounce your name correctly. What can you do to be an ally to people whose names might be mispronounced? So here again on the screen there, we have some suggestions in the speech bubbles. So if your friend or colleague or student or client is not there when their name is being said wrongly by someone, and you know how it should be said, you should correct the person doing that mispronouncing again. Not ideal if you do it in a group setting, but in a one-to-one setting or after that group kind of context is finished, do it then, follow up on it then. Make sure that you do know how to correctly say the names of your colleagues and friends and clients and students. Show your interest in understanding their name-based identity by inviting them to tell you about names in their cultures, the particular naming conventions that might operate in their cultures, and invite them to teach you how to say their name correctly. The key thing is to respect people's choices. So some people might, after all, prefer to use an English name or a shortened version of their real name to avoid problems of mispronunciations. We need to respect people's choices here. We can understand why those choices might have been made, but we need to respect what people choose to call themselves. Okay, so we're coming towards the end of the workshop in terms of the main bit. We're hoping to have some time for questions and answers at the end. But just to kind of continue your journey in terms of reflective thinking about your own practices, I'd like you to go back to menti.com and tell me one way you think this workshop has made you think differently about names, whether that's your own names or other people's names, and one thing that you will do that is new or different as a result of this workshop. So I'm just going to toggle back to Menti. Where's that gone? Escape from that. And go back to the feedback slide. So we have a new code now. So the code now is 51738808. So we'll just wait to see some responses coming through there. So how has this workshop made you think differently? And one thing that you might do differently as a result of attending this workshop. Okay, nice one to start with. Keeping in mind the difference between voluntary and involuntary renaming. It goes back to respecting people's choices. If they choose to have an English name or a shortened version of their name, then respect their choice. Okay, coming in fast and thick now. Don't be afraid to tell folk how to pronounce my name correctly. Discuss our names and those of our students. Absolutely, I think it's a really good kind of like icebreaker activity to have at the beginning of a course or at the beginning of a module, to do this kind of identity and names open table discussion. It's a great way to get people sharing their names and sharing their cultures. Ask students about the naming conventions in their culture. It's helpful to think about naming as an equality, diversity, and inclusivity issue. Adding an audio name badge, great. I do hope that people will do that. It's so simple and quick to do. The only thing I didn't like about it was I didn't like the sound of my own voice in the recording. I must have done it about 3 times till I was thinking, well, it's not getting any better. It'll just have to stay as it is. Keeping an audio record of names of students. Yeah. Well, I mean, you could get your students to themselves include audio name badges in their email signatures. That would be one thing to do, because many of them don't even have an email signature to start with. So it's kind of a double win, because you're getting them to improve their presentation skills in terms of, you know, how they present themselves through email, but you'd also get to capture an audio recording of them saying their own name. Including it in staff training, that's great. Make notes of any pronunciations I struggle with. So adding a pronunciation for my name to encourage other students to do this as well. Made me more aware of my preference to assert the correct pronunciation of my name. And it's not difficult. Names aren't, you know, often they're not difficult to if you kind of break them down, or you just, you know, you get to know how to say them. So it's something that people worry about, but if they work at it, it can be quite easy in the end. Okay. Often my sense of my own embarrassment that leads me to avoid saying some names wrongly. How students feel about it, exactly. I think it's really important to be conscious of how in a classroom setting you can be excluding some groups of students if you're avoiding saying their names and not able to participate as fully in the class as other students. Okay, trying to spell out people's names phonetically to help me with pronunciation. Okay, super, some super answers there. Thank you so much for sharing. So I'm just going to go back now to the slideshow. Just bear with. Okay. So I hope you continue to reflect on some of the things that you kind of had inserted into your brain about names. I hope to have turned you all into name nerds. It's a very catching thing. Once you start thinking about names and identities, you can't really stop. At least that's what I found. If you want some more resources, you can go using this QR code and find some. So we've produced a how to do the audio name badge step-by-step guide. There's also 10 top tips on saying students' names right, how to approach saying students' names right. So you can go to our website, our project website, and you can freely download those. The other thing there in the yellow graphic, a really good resource from Anpu of London, who has done this lovely kind of resource about how to respect my ethnic name. So that's really something that's very useful as well. So we now come to question and answer time. I think we've got a good 15 minutes now, so the timing's worked out pretty well. There's some references there for those of you who want to follow up on anything, but I'm going to probably stop sharing my screen now so I can see people again, and hopefully we'll have some questions and answers. I'm sure people have been putting things into the chat. I haven't been able to see that myself. But if there is some things in the chat, perhaps we could pick up on a few of those. But if you do have any questions, then fire away, raise your hand. I don't know quite how it works on Zoom. I'm not a Zoom user myself very often, but fire away with any questions or anything in the chat. I can see 51 things in the chat, so I'm sure there's something there. I'm happy for you to share your experiences about, as being an educator and your own kind of experiences as well. Any lessons that you can teach Hannah and I that we haven't already talked about.
There's some interesting comments in the chat about staff having their own name mispronounced and actually choosing to use English names themselves to avoid that. So that's quite sort of interesting that staff are experiencing this at the same time as students.
Absolutely, and we did find that in our study, didn't we, Hannah? In fact, some of the, we had 10 staff participants in our study, and a good proportion of those were partly motivated to take part because of their own experiences of having their name mispronounced, and it kind of sensitized them to the issue for students. Their own experiences had made them realize how students would be experiencing and how students would be feeling.
Oh, I think there's a hand up as well.
I can't see that, so I don't know how to manage that.
Is it Stella's got a hand
Yes,
up?
it is. So I've got many of my students give themselves an English name, and I'm very much, I say, I always use their Chinese name. But you've got me thinking that, I always think Chinese my students in particular are using an English name because they say it's because it's easier for us to pronounce. I think some of them actually quite like having an English name, but it always makes my skin crawl, when I kind of think, no, I want to use your name. So I'm always using their Chinese name. But in your experience, in your research, did you find any students that were saying, no, we actually like using an English name? It has it kind of gives us another character. It gives us a bit more confidence in what we're doing. Did you come across anything like that?
We didn't, actually. Most of the students who seemed to take part in our study were again motivated because they were cross mostly about how their names were being mangled by educators. So I can't think of an example where a student voluntarily renamed themselves and was happy about it. So the voluntary thing is kind of in inverted commas. But some of the studies that I cited, which have looked at these voluntary renaming experiences of international students studying English-speaking universities, reported this very experience, that lecturers were keen to use their students' Chinese names, were confident in how to pronounce their students' Chinese names, and they tried to persist in using their students' Chinese names. The students didn't want them to. So they wanted to have an English name in the way that you're kind of suggesting, I guess. So there was a kind of almost like clash of perspectives between the lecturers and the students. And my recommendation would be respect what the students' choice is, because they might have a number of reasons for choosing an English name. And, you might speak to them on a one-to-one basis and say, well, I am saying your name correctly, aren't I? And, I would be keen to use your Chinese name. But, in a one-to-one meeting, you could try and establish why. But if at the end of the day, it's their identity, it's their choice. So you need to respect their choice, I would suggest.
I suppose it's like on a practical level, it's really confusing as well, because you'll end up with all your records as a teacher.
Right.
And if you've got 58 students and you've got to learn 2 names, and that's that can be impractical sometimes, it doesn't work that well. So yeah, interesting.
Yeah, I mean, some of the studies that have looked at this have suggested that, because it is voluntary in inverted commas, once a student understands that their name can be respected in an educational context, then they might be more willing to use their ethnic name. But it's kind of almost like a self-defensive strategy on the part of the student to make those kinds of choices. So if they can be reassured, then maybe they're more likely to choose to use their ethnic name. But, it's something you're going to have to establish, I guess, and it won't be the same for every single student. Each student will feel differently about it.
Yeah, thank you.
Was there anything else in the chat, or anyone else want to share their experiences? I can see someone saying it's just tiring to correct people every single time. That's something that came out really strongly in our research amongst the students. It's hard and it's tedious work. constantly correct people's pronunciation of your name. And this is one of the reasons why our recommendations from this project is that universities as a whole, or educational organisations as a whole, have to get better at providing what we're calling whole institution solutions, so that it's not the student's responsibility every time they meet a new educator to say, well, this is how you say my name. There needs to be some processes in place using technology where educators can access accurate information about how all their students' names can be pronounced. It can be very difficult. If you've got 300 students, you're really going to be expected to use 300 students, learn how to say 300 students' names. So there's all sorts of, difficulties, hindrances in depending on the context of the learning environment. But we need to take the pressure off the students, take that hard and tedious work away from the students, and institutions and organisations need to have better systems in place to enable educators to respect their students' names. Because what we found was educators are already doing a lot of work around this as individuals on an ad hoc basis, sucking and seeing solutions, trying different solutions, sometimes not choosing very wisely, doing a random Google kind of search on how to pronounce a name when there are more specific name pronunciation tools out there. But basically this issue of how to respect people's names needs to be embedded in staff training. It needs to be embedded in student induction. There needs to be student record systems. The software needs to have a capacity to include audio recordings of students' names embedded in each individual student's record, so that's accessible to educators. We already have students' record systems where there are photographs of our students. It's not that big a leap to include alongside the photograph an audio recording of the student saying their own name. So these are the kind of whole institution solutions that are part of our kind of policy recommendations coming out of our research on these issues.
I think there was a comment in the chat as well, Jane, about language differences and sounds that aren't common in the English language, that they can be particularly challenging, which of course we did find some sort of staff saying certain Chinese names in particular were a real challenge for people. So I think that is definitely something. So in some cases, I guess it's specific training on. Another comment was that they actually ran sessions specifically for pronouncing Chinese student names. So I think it sometimes is quite a specific issue with a particular group of students as well.
Yeah. And it goes back to what you were saying, Hannah, was that, not everybody's can be taught how to say everybody's name, but we need some sort of more guidance about kind of to sort of frame the way we approach learning how to say people's names, to avoid that kind of embarrassment and putting students on the spot and putting the kind of onus on them to kind of manage their identities through the way that we say or don't say their name correctly.
Yeah. And I think a lot of the comments about respecting people's choices when they choose a shortened version or a English version of their name, I think that's quite complicated, because like what Stella was saying, some people say, oh, I want to use this English name, but that's often come after years of frustration. Yes. So yes, it's voluntary, but actually for some of our students, I don't know that it was voluntary. It was sort of a frustrated decision to do that. So I think if those students were in an institution that was at least showing an effort or a willingness to try and get their real or first name right, they might actually be less likely to opt for that English or shortened version of their name.
That's right, and that came through very strongly from some of our staff participants as well.
Yeah,
they kind of renamed themselves after years of having their name mispronounced, as well as some of our students doing it. So it's more like they tolerate these kind of things, this renaming that goes on, rather than wholeheartedly accepting it.
I think one of the problems of Chinese names is that sometimes the mispronunciation sounds incredibly insulting, so people don't want to hear that. And also this kind of way of just using one name Like I noticed one of my colleagues was introduced himself as Jador, and then immediately my colleague said, "Oh, hello, Dor." And I don't think even his mother will call him just that one name. You know, it's too intimate. It's not right. So it's not just pronunciation, but it's conventions of the name.
Yeah. So you've touched on several things there. Tonal languages. It's not just even it's not just a matter of simple pronunciation. It's to do with tones. And then you've mentioned here about also in some cultures it would be disrespectful to use a certain part of a person's name. So it's not, you're correct, it's not just about name pronunciation, it's about understanding about the link between names and identities more broadly. One other thing that came out from our students particularly was frustration with email protocols and how they kind of get lumbered when they begin an educational institution with an email name that they didn't necessarily realize they were signing up for, and it kind of stays with them through the rest of their studies. So they wanted it to be easier to change their email kind of name that they'd kind of ended up with to reflect better their preferred name-based identity. So that was an important frustration for them, and then they didn't really often know how they could do that or whether they could do that at all. Part of our research took place in the kind of hangover from the pandemic, so there were some interesting things too about online learning environments and how sometimes having the students' names displayed on screen when they were teaching was actually a kind of beneficial thing for them. But conversely, the kind of peculiarities of how Teams displays and the order that Teams displays people's names in caused confusion as well. So there's interesting things around names and identities in terms of this kind of software protocols for naming and how that can cause problems for students and for staff.
Somebody's commented in the chat about university procedures when students change their preferred gender and how it can be an issue in changing student records, which we interestingly did have quite a few students. It wasn't one of the questions that we asked. We didn't ask anything about gender identity really, but quite a few did say, you know, universities and other people are now showing more respect towards gender pronouns, but actually people still aren't getting my actual name right. So it's almost like that move to respect gender pronouns has actually made people think, oh, well, if we're respecting gender pronouns, you can get my name right as well. People really did link those two things together, which is not really something we anticipated, I don't think, but there definitely was a sense amongst the students to get everything right if you're going to try and get it right.
Okay, I think we're running out of contributions and comments. So those are some interesting things about cultural variations. So someone said about Japan, nobody uses a male given name, even family members. There are many other cultures where naming conventions avoid the use of a given name.
So have we got any more comments or questions for Jane and Hannah, or shall we finish off there? I think I would just like to say, please, if you can, sign up to our JISC mail, become a member of our SIG. It would be great to hear from you. Please contact us also if you would like to give a talk yourselves. If you would like to, maybe yourself or your students or somebody you know that think would be interesting. And also fill in the feedback form. Stella, are you going to put that in the chat or something? Yeah, thank you. So, sorry, I didn't introduce myself. I'm not called Joanne's iPad. I'm called Joanne Shield, and I'm also a convener of this SIG.
I'm just going to stop recording now, okay? Just so that if anybody wants to do any final comments, but I'll stop recording now.